Have you ever immersed yourself in the world of fantasies? There are people who delve so deeply into their own dreams that the line between the imaginary and the real blurs for them. Usually, this doesn't affect those around them, as the dreamer simply lives in their own imaginary world. But what happens if such a fantasizer tries to drag someone else into their illusions? This story demonstrates just how dangerous such situations can be. Morgan Ashley Fox was born on August 22, 1991, in the small town of Canton, Ohio, which had a population of about 70,000. From a young age, she was an obedient and calm child, a diligent student, and a loving daughter. Morgan had many friends and easily got along with any group. She was popular among her peers at school. As a teenager, she started dating a boy, and shortly after graduation, she found out she was pregnant. The young couple in love was over the moon with happiness. They had a daughter, whom they named Amelia. Due to her early pregnancy, Morgan did not go to college. Instead, she got a job as an operations manager at FedEx delivery service. It was here, during one of her shifts, that she met and befriended a colleague named Jason Allen McDermott. The young man was only 4 months older than his new friend. He spent most of his free time on the internet and was passionate about video games. Gradually, co-workers began to notice that Jason was literally obsessed with Morgan. He brought her food and drinks during every lunch break and constantly talked about her to his friends and acquaintances. All of this gave the impression that there was something more than just friendship and communication between the young people. In fact, his behavior resembled an obsessive infatuation that alarmed some of his colleagues. The guy found Morgan's social media pages and started following her posts. He even installed a special app to monitor her activity confidentially. At times, Jason secretly recorded videos of the girl. Despite his fascination, he behaved in a friendly manner and didn't bother Morgan to the point of causing her displeasure. In August 2020, Morgan brought her friend Mary to the company for training, and Mary ended up under Jason's supervision. The girl immediately noticed how often and how much he talked about Morgan. It was so intrusive that Mary suspected something was off and advised Jason to stop and cease tracking her friend. She wanted the guy to stop monitoring Morgan's social media pages and gradually distance himself from her in order to cope with his obsession. Mary knew about similar cases of stalking and understood that it could all end badly. Unfortunately, the secret admirer ignored this advice. Despite Mary's warnings, he constantly admired Morgan's beautiful hair, talked about her daughter, and everything related to the object of his desire. Jason clearly sought to develop a relationship and started with friendship. Now he had a new obsessive idea to ask Morgan out. He completely ignored the fact that the girl was already in a serious relationship, preparing for a wedding, and everything was going well with her fiancé. In June 2020, Morgan moved into a new house on Fraser Avenue with her fiancé and daughter Amelia. To celebrate the housewarming and her birthday, our story's heroine decided to throw a party, inviting friends, relatives, and co-workers, including Jason. At that time, she considered him just a friend and was unaware of his obsession. For Jason, however, this invitation was another sign that Morgan was hiding her feelings for him. He had repeatedly shared his ideas about getting closer to the girl with other employees, but most doubted his plan would succeed. Of course, he ignored these warnings, as his own fantasies convinced him of the need to confess to his beloved. Jason decided to use the party to finally stop being just a friend and become Morgan's boyfriend. During the celebration, Jason acted as if he were a member of Morgan's family. When the girl was showing the guests around her new apartment, the secret admirer was scurrying about, helping to prepare for the party, serving food himself, and even chatting with Morgan's grandmother as if she were his relative. Overall, he was friendly and nice, but such behavior seemed somewhat odd. Some of those present tried to figure out who this young man was and whether he had a relationship with Morgan, but the girl denied any romantic involvement, calling Jason just a good friend and colleague. This probably greatly saddened the guy, as he never dared to confess his feelings, fearing rejection. Later, an incident occurred that seriously damaged their friendly relationship. On October 8, 2020, Morgan briefly left her mobile phone unattended at work. Jason, knowing the password he had previously peeked at, took this opportunity to learn even more about his beloved. On her device, he unexpectedly discovered intimate photos of Morgan and, being delighted, even showed them to other guys from the office. Upon returning to her workplace, the girl quickly realized that someone had used her phone and viewed the explicit pictures. This made her very angry. The obvious suspect was Jason, who was constantly hanging around her desk. Colleagues hinted to Morgan to pay attention to 3 young men who were discussing something near her place during lunch. They immediately gave up Jason. The furious Morgan accused him of violating her privacy. At first, the guy denied everything, but under pressure, he confessed. The girl was enraged, ceased communication, and blocked the secret admirer on social media. Finally, her eyes were opened to his unhealthy obsession and stalking. She heard from colleagues about his frank conversations and infatuation with her, which caused concern. Morgan knew about stalkers and was afraid of becoming a victim of one. Therefore, she completely cut off contact with Jason and even told colleagues about her desire to change jobs. Obviously, Morgan's reaction was not taken calmly by Jason, although he understood his guilt. He assured the girl that he had only viewed her intimate photos but had not downloaded or shared them, although it later turned out to be untrue. However, Morgan was adamant in her decision to stay away from him. Meanwhile, Jason asked colleagues to help him restore communication with the girl. He wrote her a long letter of apology, which several acquaintances signed. In this message, the guy begged for forgiveness and asked to be unblocked on social media. Through the mediation of colleagues, he continued to bombard Morgan with messages and tried to call her, but was rejected every time. Jason's friends and co-workers noticed changes in his behavior and appearance literally the day after Morgan brushed him off. He became disheveled, unkempt, and ignored remarks from the department manager. It was evident that due to the quarrel and obsession, Jason was barely sleeping and looked bad. Moreover, during lunch breaks, it became noticeable that he had stopped eating properly. Despite everything, the young man still cherished the hope of restoring a relationship with his colleague, with whom he was obsessed. On October 24, 2020, Morgan was visiting relatives in Columbus, Ohio. Jason sent her a short message asking how she got to her family. The girl was shocked, as she had told almost no one about this trip. She realized that Jason was still following her. When she asked him how he knew about her being in another city, there was no response. This brief dialogue was the last documented communication between our story's heroine and her stalker. On October 28, 2020, the day passed at home with family, her fiancé and daughter for 29-year-old Morgan Fox. She was preparing to go to work for the night shift, which started at 2:30. The child's father walked his beloved to the door, kissed her goodbye, and they parted ways. He went to bed, and she headed to the car. When the man woke up around 6 a.m. to get ready for work, he made himself coffee as usual and looked out the window. What he saw instantly alarmed him. Morgan's car was still in the driveway, and moreover, it was parked in such a way that it could not be fully seen. This seemed strange, as his fiancée's work shift had not yet ended. Troubled by what he saw, the guy decided to go outside and examine the car with his own eyes to find out what had happened. On the way, he grabbed his mobile phone and tried to call Morgan. But at the very moment he crossed the threshold and opened the front door, he heard the sound of her phone ringing. The fiancé ran to the car and saw a terrible sight. The driver's side door was open, and in the seat was his beloved, covered in blood and showing no signs of life. She did not respond to the calls of her mobile phone, which lay at her feet on the ground and was ringing incessantly. Stunned by what he saw, the frightened young man immediately called 911 emergency services. A team of paramedics along with the police arrived at the scene in just a few minutes. They officially declared 29-year-old Morgan Fox dead, the cause of which left no doubt 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Apparently, the victim had just managed to get behind the wheel when she was attacked. Her feet were still on the ground, while her body was already in the car seat. Characteristic signs of rigor mortis had already appeared on the body, by which the time of death was determined quite accurately around 2 o'clock in the morning. The girl died instantly and without suffering after the very first fatal shot to the head. Unfortunately, there were no video surveillance cameras installed in the area of the house where the couple lived. Also, no spent casings were found at the crime scene. Neither the neighbors nor the victim's fiancé heard any gunshots or noise from an unfamiliar vehicle. None of them noticed anything suspicious that night. Nevertheless, the investigators managed to find tire tracks on the asphalt that were obviously left in a hurry. It appears the attacker fired 2 shots, probably from a pistol equipped with a silencer, and then quickly disappeared from the crime scene in a car. This was clearly evidenced by the nature of the traces on the road surface. Clumps of earth and dirt were even torn out from under the wheels. However, despite this, none of the local residents heard anything suspicious. The deceased fiancée and her friends told investigators about one intrusive young man who had been behaving strangely for a long time and was clearly very interested in Morgan. Of course, they were talking about Jason, her co-worker, with whom the girl's relationship had seriously deteriorated shortly before the tragedy. Many considered him the most likely suspect in Morgan's murder. The police decided to check his alibi and found out that he had arrived at his night shift at 2:59 a.m., where he stayed until about 10 a.m., after which he went home. Theoretically, the guy had the opportunity to commit the crime, as his alibi was not confirmed at 2 a.m., but the time window turned out to be quite narrow, which only increased suspicions about him. Many people described Jason's strange relationship with Morgan, who, in her naivety, allowed him to get too close to her. People said that she allowed this man too much, recalling at least his behavior during the party at her house, where he felt like the host. Ultimately, it all resulted in a clear violation of privacy and an intrusion into the girl's personal life, because of which she completely ceased communication with this colleague. Investigators were well aware of this model of behavior, and stalkers refusing to communicate often becomes a motive for them to attack. The most interesting information for the police was the serious changes in the young man's behavior that occurred immediately after Morgan brushed him off. He became sloppy and was clearly struggling with some psychological problems. But interestingly, after the murder, Jason specifically went to a car wash after work and thoroughly cleaned his blue Ford inside and out, even though it was raining outside, so there was no particular point in washing the car. In general, this did not fit with his careless attitude towards his own appearance lately, which his colleagues had talked about. According to them, he did not care about his appearance, let alone his car. Moreover, according to their testimony, the car was in good condition and clearly did not need maintenance. An examination of his vehicle yielded no results. Nothing was found inside. Of course, the investigators treated this information with suspicion. First of all, they checked the only available evidence: the tire tracks left in the mud in front of the victim's driveway. It seemed that the tread prints were identical to the tires of Jason's car. Moreover, such a tread pattern was quite rare. Undoubtedly, this automatically made him the prime suspect in the murder. New testimony quickly emerged that confirmed the detectives' suspicions. In search of evidence, the police reviewed the recordings from all the surveillance cameras that could have captured the perpetrator's route. In the footage, they managed to spot a car similar to Jason's when it stopped at one of the intersections near Morgan's house. The recording was made at 1:38 a.m., after which the car headed towards the home of his future victim. It was captured on cameras a second time around 2:17 a.m., when it was returning the same way. Assuming the perpetrator acted quickly, he could well have fit into the allotted time frame. When investigators learned about Jason's intrusive behavior, they decided to thoroughly examine his electronic devices. Thanks to this, the detectives were able to prove that the suspect was gathering information about the girl, secretly monitoring her activity on social networks. This allowed him to find out almost everything about her: where she lived, what her daily routine was, which made it possible to plan the attack in such a way as to remain unnoticed. To the investigators' surprise, the suspect's phone was not detected in the area of the victim's home at the time of her murder. All this time, the device was at Jason's house. The guy explained this by saying that he had forgotten his mobile phone and worked the whole shift without it. For the same reason, he allegedly could not find out why the object of his obsession did not show up for work. However, this did not exclude the possibility that he deliberately left the phone at home to avoid tracking his whereabouts and divert suspicion from himself. The perpetrator turned out to be quite cunning and cautious, which seriously complicated the investigation. On November 1, Jason published a post on his social media page in memory of Morgan, in which he wrote, "You were a bright light in my life and the lives of many other people. You were always there when I needed you. I would like to list everything about how you influenced my life, but the list would be so long that we would never reach the end. You were a friend if I had a bad day. I knew that I could always come and talk to you." Jason continued, "It's so strange that you are no longer around. It has left a huge hole in my heart. But I know that you will always watch over us, your family, your friends, and your daughter. You have made an unforgettable impact on the lives of all of us, and you will never be forgotten." This post ended with the hashtag Justice for Morgan. 3 days after the crime, Jason went to the Walmart store with his friend Mickey. There he continued to talk about Morgan, who is no longer among the living. From Jason's words, it followed that he had an intimate relationship with the deceased girl, and now these memories would remain the only recollection of her, which he intended to cherish for the rest of his life. 4 more days after the massacre, he again found himself in the company of his buddy Mickey. This time, his colleagues went to say goodbye to the victim of the attack, Though Jason behaved strangely again, he asked several people about exactly how the video cameras that record traffic on the roads work. He was interested in whether they record continuously or only take short videos when sensors detect speeding. But he never got an answer to his question. During a meeting with the mother of the deceased at the funeral, Jason continued to surprise with his behavior. He told the woman a story about how he once gave her daughter a stuffed toy, and now he insistently asked to return this gift, claiming that it would be a good reminder of what a wonderful person Morgan was. The young man was so persistent that he almost broke into the mother of the victim's car, begging her to give him the toy. The woman even had to raise her voice to finally get him off her back with this request. Fortunately, the evidence gathered against Jason in the form of surveillance camera footage and tire tread marks was sufficient for his arrest. On November 4, 2020, he was detained on suspicion of committing the murder, and later charged with premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances and stalking with threats. After the arrest of the victim's former friend, the police carefully examined his hands. In the case of using a firearm, traces of gunpowder gases can remain on the skin for a long time, and they are not always washed off even during a shower. Therefore, there was a possibility that even a few days after the crime, these traces could still be detected. Forensic experts conducted a thorough analysis, but no powder residue was found on Jason's body. His clothing, which he was wearing on the night of the attack, was also checked, but no traces of gunpowder gases were found on it either. This fact was actively used by the suspect's lawyer, trying to prove the absence of direct evidence and the clear contradiction of the facts with the version of the investigation. The trial in the case was scheduled for April 2, 2021. Oddly enough, several witnesses from the immediate circle of both the victim and Jason himself considered the murder charge against him to be erroneous. The defense argued that the police relied only on indirect evidence, while there was no direct evidence of the young man's involvement in the girl's death. Many friends and relatives described him as a calm and non-aggressive person. Despite his obvious obsession with his colleague, none of them could believe that Jason was capable of such a thing. And indeed, the prosecution's arguments were based solely on indirect evidence. The detectives immediately dismissed the versions of robbery or sexual assault. Firstly, the victim was not missing anything, including valuables in the car and her purse. Secondly, no signs of sexual violence were found either. It was a quiet, peaceful area where no gangs operated, so Morgan could hardly have become an accidental victim of some criminal showdown. The nature of the tire tread marks found at the crime scene matched those of the defendant's car. Moreover, the attacker clearly tried to make it so that his car remained unnoticed by the victim. He could have lurked in ambush, waiting for the right moment. According to the prosecutors, the defendant wanted Morgan not to see his vehicle until it was too late, and she did not have time to call for help. One of the key questions in the case was the murder weapon, which was never found. It was known that Jason owned a firearm. He had a Ruger .22 caliber revolver, which law enforcement seized for inspection. The victim was shot with a similar weapon, but after a ballistic examination, it became clear that this particular revolver was not the instrument of the crime. The investigation never managed to find the very pistol from which the fatal shots were fired. However, this did not exclude the possibility that Jason could have illegally purchased another pistol with a silencer, killed the girl, and then disposed of the weapon. In addition, the prosecution focused on the suspect's strange behavior, in particular on the fact that he thoroughly washed his car, probably immediately after the attack, and this despite the fact that it was raining outside. The young man tried to explain his actions by the presence of mental problems and symptoms of obsessive-compulsive disorder. However, experts did not confirm the presence of such disorders or depressive states in him. He was indeed depressed because Morgan stopped communicating with him, and against this background, he had recently behaved, on the contrary, untidily. Anyway, taken together, these facts looked extremely suspicious. When the defendant was asked why he was in the area of the victim's home shortly before her murder, he denied the very fact of his presence there. However, there was no exact geolocation data to confirm the police's words, since his phone remained at home, and the GPS module in the car was turned off. The only evidence that he was there was the recordings from the surveillance cameras, but the defense argued that the footage simply captured a similar car because due to the poor quality of the night shooting, it was impossible to see the license plates. As for washing the car, Jason additionally explained this by saying that he was allegedly going to go to his mother to give her a birthday present, so he decided to wash the car beforehand. However, as it turned out, the holiday itself took place back in June, 4 months before that, so on the part of the son, it looked like an obvious delay. Naturally, the court regarded his words as untrue. Numerous witnesses at the trial spoke about the defendant's obsessive behavior towards Morgan. He clearly tried to cross boundaries and pretend to be a much closer person than he actually was. The girl did not take his behavior seriously, which allowed him to get so close to her and even cherish illusions about a possible shared future. Jason did indeed manage to become a close friend of Morgan's, right up until he violated her privacy by looking at the explicit photos. This happened just 20 days before the massacre, after which the young man desperately tried to restore their communication. But all his efforts were in vain. It was probably this that pushed him to such radical actions. After all, he was the only one with a real motive for murder. On the night of the murder, colleagues noticed striking changes in Jason's behavior at work. He looked much more cheerful than in previous days. When asked what had happened, the guy said that Morgan had supposedly resumed communication with him and even added him as a friend on social media, so he hoped that she had given him another chance. However, employees doubted the truthfulness of his words, because before that they had communicated with Morgan and knew about her unwavering position regarding Jason. The girl was determined not only to ignore her former friend, but also intended to change jobs. She admitted that she had allowed this guy too much, because of which she lost control of the situation. It was obvious that there could never be anything between them. That same night, Jason showed his colleagues a photograph in which he and Morgan were pictured together in the office. He considered this picture a wonderful friendly gift. At the same time, the guy himself expressed concern that the girl did not show up for work. To all the questions of his colleagues, he answered that he had no idea where Morgan could be since he had left his mobile phone at home. Later, when everyone learned about the girl's death, his actions began to seem even stranger. Jason's behavior changed again. He became more agitated and repeatedly expressed concern that GPS data from his car could be the reason for being held liable. He confessed to his colleagues that he was passing through the area where Morgan lived on his way to work on the night shift, but then changed his story and began to claim that the GPS device in his car could have been hacked and someone was trying to frame him. Then Jason told his co-workers that the day after the murder, his car was allegedly stolen but quickly returned. After that, the suspect insisted that the GPS module in the car was definitely hacked, but avoided explaining what exactly caused such doubts. Later, detectives found out that Jason had created a fake social media page, which he used to spread a fictional story about his intimate relationship with Morgan. He described in detail what allegedly happened between them and even used explicit photos of the girl from her phone as confirmation of his words. This activity began back in June 2020 and, according to the prosecution, could have been an attempt to create an alibi. In these conversations, the suspect told several women the same story on behalf of Morgan, the same one that he retold to his friend Mickey while walking around the store. It seems he was trying to spread information about intimacy with the victim, probably to divert suspicion from himself. The .22 caliber cartridges, which fit the weapon with which Morgan was shot, were indeed found in the defendant's house. However, he claimed that he kept these ammunition for his father's revolver, which was given to him as a means of self-defense. Due to the absence of casings at the crime scene, the ballistic examination could not definitively establish from which weapon the shots were fired. At the same time, such a number of coincidences looked extremely suspicious and became another indirect evidence of the young man's guilt. Jason's close friend came to his defense. According to his buddy, the defendant never showed aggression or anger towards Morgan. Although he was obsessed with the girl, he would never harm her. According to the friend, Jason was extremely upset that Morgan had blocked him on social media and refused to communicate. He was very worried about this, lost his appetite and sleep. But according to the confession of a close friend, Jason blamed only himself for everything and understood that he had done wrong. He did not feel rage towards the girl and was not going to take revenge on her, so he clearly could not be the perpetrator of this murder. The defendant himself insisted that under no circumstances could he have done this to Morgan. He admitted that he had the most tender feelings for her and was ready to let her go if it was impossible to build a relationship. Jason considered his obsessive behavior a manifestation of strong feelings that his friend never managed to appreciate. The lawyers emphasized the fact that Morgan Fox was an attractive girl and had many admirers. In their opinion, from the very beginning of the investigation, the police focused only on Jason and actually did not consider other possible suspects. They say the goal of the detectives was to prove Jason's guilt and not to find the real culprit. However, despite the persuasiveness of the defense's arguments, the prosecution insisted that it had done all the necessary work, during which no other obsessed admirers of Morgan were identified, except for Jason. The deceased's fiancée also underwent a thorough check. No traces of gunpowder gases were found on his hands, which were examined immediately after the tragedy. There were no bloodstains on his clothes. He successfully passed a polygraph test. In fact, as the prosecution claimed, Jason was a skilled manipulator who had been hiding behind the mask of a friend for years. The defendant turned out to be a pathological liar who managed to deceive everyone around him. But everything's secret became apparent when he lost control of his feelings for the victim. Then it became clear that in reality, he was a self-centered and extremely jealous type. And after the phone incident, the girl decided to completely sever all ties with him. Jason harbored a grudge and decided to take revenge. He simply could not come to terms with the fact that Morgan would be with someone else. This idea was also confirmed by the behavior of the defendant himself, and he clearly cherished illusions about a relationship with the victim and passed off the desired as real, which is typical for people of this type. Despite all the efforts of the investigation, the young man turned out to be surprisingly well prepared. Throughout the entire investigation, forensic experts never managed to find the murder weapon, bullet casings, any fingerprints, DNA traces, or personal belongings that Jason could have left at the crime scene. He even managed to skillfully hide his exact whereabouts, despite the fact that modern technology is literally packed with tracking tools. All this put the prosecution in an extremely disadvantageous position. They had to convince the jury and prove the suspect's guilt, relying only on indirect evidence and assumptions. The only physical evidence that was obtained was the tread marks identical to those on the wheels of the defendant's car. The prosecution tried to prove that a typical stalker appeared before the jury, who acted exactly as people of his type usually do in such situations. He really pursued Morgan, which was confirmed by numerous correspondence and testimony of colleagues. But could he really go so far as to kill the one he loved so much? On April 2, 2021, the jury retired to the deliberation room to discuss the verdict. In the end, Jason was found guilty of murder with aggravating circumstances, as well as stalking. The young man was sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole, as well as an additional 180 days in prison for stalking. Jason never admitted his guilt, and his lawyer insisted on a review of the sentence, but none of the appeals were granted. Live, dream, but don't lose your head, dear friends. Leave likes, write comments. I wish you all the best and see you next time.